Okay, this is lab 11. In this lab, we're going to split the AV lecture into two parts. First is going to be the cranial bones, and then the second part, we're going to move into facial bones. Now, the major take-home message for this AV lecture is that cranial bones come in direct contact with the meninges of the brain. This is the major difference between cranial and facial bones. Now, meninges are these shrink-wrapped layers that go around the brain, and you have three of them. The most superficial meninge is the dura mater. One layer deep is called the arachnoid mater, and then the deepest meninge is called the pia mater. Now, if you've heard of meningitis, this is an illness that causes swelling of the meninges, and this can be a life-threatening illness. And essentially what it does is the swelling of the meninges causes pressure on your brain, and this can be very, very devastating. Now, this is why before college you were vaccinated for meningitis, because it's such a dangerous illness. Now, moving into these cranial bones, you have 6 cranial bones that we're going to go over in this AV lecture. These are the sphenoid, the temporal. You have 2 temporal bones. The ethmoid bone, the parietal bone. You have 2 parietal bones, occipital and frontal. And we've got this mnemonic device for you. Old people from Texas eat spiders. Or you could do pest of 6. This is the first letter of each of those cranial bones. And then 6 reminds you that there are 6 of them. Here we've got our cranial bones highlighted on the skull. On the anterior portion, we have our frontal bone. This is going to be your forehead. No surprise there. Your parietal bones are shown here. These are going to be forming the walls of your skull. Your temporal bone, this is, as the name suggests, this is going to be your temples, okay? So just above your mandible there, kind of that soft spot, and a little posterior, that's your temporal bones. Your occipital bone, that's going to be in the back of your head, okay? Your sphenoid bone is truly that soft spot on your skull, okay? Kind of when you get a headache and you rub that skull for a little bit of relief, you're kind of rubbing that sphenoid bone. And then we have our ethmoid bone, and it's represented here. We're going to refer to throughout these 2 AV lectures as your eye socket. We're going to call that your orbit. And your ethmoid bone is going to be found within that orbit. Now, before we go into these bones some more, we're going to come across a bunch of different sutures in this lab. And these are going to be very important because this is where your cranial bones are going to be connecting, articulating. And these are going to be named, many of them should be familiar to you because they're going to be named based on what plane they are in. So this coronal suture that I just outlined here, this is in that coronal plane, okay? And we have our frontal bone here and 2 of our parietal bones, okay? So the coronal suture is going to be separating our frontal and parietal bones here. Now next is our sagittal suture here. This is separating our 2 parietal bones, our right and left parietal bones. Our squamous suture is going to be indicated better on this image here. And this is going to be separating our temporal bone and our sphenoid bone, as well as our temporal and parietal bone. And then our last suture here is called the lambdoid suture. and this is going to be separating our our parietal bones and our occipital bone back here. Now, if you recall from physics, this symbol lambda kind of looks like this lambdoid suture, and that's why it's named that way. Now remember, when we went over joints, these sutures are not bony joints. These are fibrous joints. And we discussed that the reason for this is because these fibrous joints allow for a couple of things to occur. It allows first, at birth, it allows the brain or the head of the baby to actually flex as it passes through the birth canal. The birth canal is extremely small relative to a baby's head. And so we need to have some sort of flexibility in the skull so that we don't damage the baby's skull and brain as well as the mother's birth canal. And also, during development, having some flexibility in these fibrous joints allows the brain to develop, because as we know, the brain is going to get bigger throughout development, and these fibrous joints allow that brain to do so. Now here we are just summarizing these sutures again: coronal, sagittal, lambdoid, squamous, and we're just telling you which bones they are separating here. So let's move into specifically these bones. First is we've got our frontal bone. Now the root word of frontal bone is Latin for forehead. So it makes no surprise that this bone is going to be right on our forehead. This is going to form the upper roof of the orbit. The orbit, again, is going to be our eye socket. And there's some features here that we would like you to know on the frontal bone. And I'm indicating it here. This is a foramen, and this foramen is above the orbit. So we call it the supraorbital foramen, meaning the foramen that's above the orbit. Next bone is our parietal bone. It's indicated in red here. The root word of parietal means walls, and this is going to form the walls of our skull. Next is our temporal bone, and there are a bunch of features that we want you to know, so we're going to highlight these now. First of which is the zygomatic process, which is indicated here. We also have the mandibular fossa, which is inferior. We'll highlight that at on a different slide. We also have the external auditory meatus, okay? And this is not just a foramen, this is a legitimate canal, okay? And this is where you're going to have your ears located, at this external auditory meatus. We have this sharp projection here, and anytime we have a sharp projection here, we know that this is our styloid process. We saw this in the radius and the ulna, those sharp points on the distal ends of those bones were called styloid processes. And similarly, we have this sharp projection on the temporal bone, and this is our styloid process of the temporal bone. And then finally, we have the mastoid process, and you can actually, if you can feel this, if you palpate just behind your ears, you can feel this bump coming down from your temporal bone, and this is going to be your mastoid process. This is a very important feature when we get to muscles, because you have a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid that actually attaches at the mastoid process there. And here we are indicating that temporal bone for you. Jesus. This is just... We're going to have to edit this out. Don't worry about that. We'll edit that out nicely. Moving forward. Now we're looking at a transverse section of the skull, and we're looking from the superior side of this transverse section. And the temporal bone is highlighted with this blue arrow here. And we've got one temporal bone here in purple and the other in purple here. And we're representing the internal auditory meatus. We had the external from that lateral view, but now we're looking internally, and so we have this internal auditory meatus. And this is what's going to house the middle and the inner ear cavities. And we're going to have a bunch of receptors here, which we'll go into in later labs, but this is where receptors and special organs are going to interpret hearing as well as get a sense of balance. This image is representing an inferior view of the skull, and we're now looking at, we're interested in our occipital bone, and that's represented in blue here. This is our, or in green, excuse me, occipital bone. And this is the most posterior part of the skull, and it's also mostly forms the base of the skull as well. Now we have these two features here that I'm highlighting in red, and these are going to be our occipital condyles. And if we recall from our vertebrae AV lecture, this is where your atlas, or your C1, your cervical vertebrae 1, is going to articulate. So this is where the skull and the vertebrae meet. We also have this very large foramen here, and we call that the foramen magnum. Anytime you see magnum, that means big. And so what do you think is going to pass through here? Well, if we know that the atlas is going to connect to the vertebrae, this is where the brain stem is going to extend inferiorly from the brain. And we have the spinal column running down the vertebrae. And then finally, on the occipital bone, we have a feature called the occipital protuberance, the external occipital protuberance, which I've circled here. And you can palpate this if you just feel, if you start down at your cervical vertebrae and just kind of palpate superiorly, you will notice that there's this sharp projection on your occipital bone. And we call this the external occipital protuberance. And if you've ever, if you have a dog at home tonight, go ahead and rub your dog's occipital bone, just the posterior part, and you will notice that they have a very exaggerated external occipital protuberance. Okay, now we're looking at the sphenoid bone, and that is highlighted in beige in this skull. This is a transverse section of the skull, and we're looking from a superior view. This image of the sphenoid is actually now a posterior view. This is for reference here. And the sphenoid bone means, sphenoid means wedge-like. And you can kind of see that it has this wedge shape, and it kind of fits in the skull like a wedge. And there's some features here. We have our lesser wing, which is shown here. And then we also have this greater wing, which is relatively bigger than that lesser wing there. This right here, this feature is called the body of the sphenoid. And then we have two features that are shown here. We have the lateral pterygoid process and the medial pterygoid process. And in later labs, this is where two muscles called the lateral and medial pterygoid attach. And these are going to be muscles that are involved in mastication, in chewing. We're still looking at the sphenoid bone here, but this time we've got a different view. We're looking at the superior, from a superior view of the transverse section of the skull. And an important feature is shown here, and this is highlighted here. This is called the sella turcica. And the sella turcica literally translates to Turkish saddle. And, you know, it's kind of abstract, but you might be able to visualize that it sort of looks like a saddle on a horse. But we're more interested in the anatomy here. So a couple of key features to discuss here. We first, in this depression, this is called the hypophyseal fossa. And this is where the pituitary gland is going to sit. The pituitary gland is going to be on the inferior side of the brain, and that is going to fit nicely into this hypophyseal fossa. Another feature is this right here, and this is called the dorsum sellae. And this is kind of like a little barrier where the pituitary gland is going to sit in there. Now, on the lesser wing, just to get oriented, this is the lesser wing here, just kind of outlining it in red. There's some foramen here. Underneath here, right in here, we're going to have the optic foramen. And this is where the optic nerve is going to pass through, as well as some key arteries. Now on the greater wing again is going to be down here. This is going to be the greater wing, not a great circle. My apologies for that. We've got some more foramina here. This first one, this is our foramen rotundum. And then we've got our foramen ovale here and our foramen spinosum. On this upper image, we can highlight them. This is rotundum. This is going to be our ovale, and then finally our foramen spinosum. And this is going to be where we have arteries and other nerves passing through. This image here is just showing a cross-section. This image on the left is showing a cross-section of the skull, a mid-sagittal section. And we're indicating the sphenoid bone with this blue arrow here. And this just gives you an idea of where the sphenoid bone is. Now, just to highlight this area right here, this is going to be our sella turcica, right? And our pituitary gland would just sit right in there. On this image on the right, this is a inferior view of the sphenoid bone, and you can see the sphenoid bone is kind of in this darker purple here. And so this is what it looks like from underneath the skull. Now we're moving on to our final bone for this AV lecture, and this is the ethmoid bone. For reference, this is where we're looking. So this is going to be a bone that is just superior to your nose. And standing alone, this is what that bone looks like here. And this is going to be found at the roof of the nose between the orbital cavities, and it forms the lateral walls and the roof of your nasal cavity. And on our orbit here, the ethmoid bone is shown in green here. So this is our ethmoid bone here. A couple of key features that we want to be sure that we're able to identify for a practical quiz. First is the cribriform plate, and that is what I'm highlighting right here. Now the cribriform plate is going to have these holes here, and these are called olfactory foramina. And as the name suggests, this is going to be involved in olfaction or smell. So the location of this bone, this makes sense, it's right at your nose. So this is going to be a bone that's very important in smelling. And these olfactory foramina, this is where you're going to have nerves perforating through that are going to pick up chemicals in the environment that are later translated into smell at the brain. There's another feature here, this triangular feature here. This is called your crista galli, and this literally translates to the crest of the cock or rooster. We also have a feature extending down inferiorly from the ethmoid bone, and this is called the perpendicular plate. And this is going to be forming part of your nasal septum, kind of that divider in your nose. And then we also have two features here, one here, and these are called, for now we're going to refer to them as our conchi, and that's because they kind of look like shells. If you see like a conch, if you think about a conch, this is what they're referring to, these conchi here. Now let's go into those conchi bones or features with a little more detail. So we're looking at this area here. This is going to be our ethmoid bone, also shown here. This is going to be our cribriform plate, crista galli right here. And these nasal conchi, we have the two that we were highlighting on the previous slide was the middle nasal conchi, which is shown here, and the inferior nasal conchi, which is shown here. There's a third one here, the nasal conchi, and this is a separate bone. This is not a feature on the ethmoid. This is a separate bone from the middle and inferior, and we're going to get into that with facial bones. But the take home for these inferior and middle nasal conchi features on the ethmoid bone is they're going to be involved in forming this nasal septum. So they're going to be coming off of that perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and they're going to be also forming some structure to this nasal septum.